Salams, this is People's Dispatch and you're watching the Daily Debrief. As always, it's a busy day in the news world. Today we're covering the visit of the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov to Brazil and a set of other countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region. We're also looking at it in the context of the recently concluded conversations of the G7 grouping and how one side is talking about peace and the other side continuing sanctions and acts of war. In our next story, we'll be talking about an important case in the Supreme Court of India, where it's being deliberated on whether same-sex marriage should be a legal right guaranteed by the state in the country that is now the most populous country in the world. And therefore, this is a decision that will potentially impact millions and millions of people in India, and not just in the context of marriage, but far beyond that. Pragya Singh will be telling us more about why. And finally, from Ohio, more bad news coming in. Police officers involved in the killing of Jayland Walker, it is now known after a grand jury verdict, will not be held responsible for any wrongdoing in that killing. Anish will tell us why and why that decision was reached and what kind of impact it will have on protests for racial justice in the United States of America. Right, in our top story, we're looking at the visit of the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov to countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. He has, of course, been already to Brazil, where he met several high-level representatives, including the foreign minister, and a statement was also issued to the press by the President Lula, talking about alternatives to, of course, reaching a state of peace in the conflict in Ukraine, as well as strengthening an already quite active relationship between Brazil and Russia, including, of course, exports between the two countries, exports and imports between the two countries, or trade between the two countries. We are looking at all of this, of course, in the context also of the meeting of the G7 grouping, where a very different set of messages came out. Abdul Rahman is in studio with us to talk more about both sides of this story. Abdul, good to have you back in the studio with us. We'll start with what we know, at least the reports that we have been seeing of Sergey Lavrov's time in Brazil and the kind of statements that also have come from Brazilian President Lula. The battle lines, of course, are drawn, but one side seems to be using the language of peace, while the other is pushing ahead with a different sort of agenda. How are you looking at the balance between the two sides at this point, given where the majority of the world's nations are sitting at the moment?
Well, if you see what happened in the G7 meeting, which just concluded in Japan, talking about, of course, reiterating the traditional Western position that what Russia is doing is only Russia's fault, and the West is basically trying to save the world. And particularly the G7 countries are trying to save the world while imposing sanctions and so on and so forth. And in that context, if you place what Lavrov is talking in Latin America, he was in Brazil yesterday, and in coming days he is visiting other countries in the region as well. Along with what Lula said when he was in China last week. If you compare both the statements, the positions are quite clear. There is a section of countries led by the G7 which basically wants to kind of create an image of a villain, and they want to polarize a section of the countries behind them. The primary motive remains, it seems, the isolation of certain countries and the continued dominance of the Western economy in the global at the global domain, but and kind of maintaining the unipolar world which emerged post 1990. But the other, if you read the statement from the other side, it basically shows the growing resistance to this particular unipolar polarity which the G7 is trying to portray. And as you rightly pointed out, their attempt to kind of challenge the dominance of the West is not rooted in kind of replying to it in the language
kind of
of war.
that they're using,
They're talking about peace, and they're emphasizing that the approaches adopted by the West Ukraine is a primary example of that, will lead to war and will lead to the destruction of the humanity in someday. You don't know when, but the sign is clear. And we need to resist it, and the only way to resist it is basically to create an alternative set of countries which basically will challenge it. Though there is no common platform, formal platform yet, but the statements given by Lula when he was in China shows that there is a common understanding growing. And Lavrov's visit in Latin America at this moment is basically to strengthen that common understanding, which is basically to challenge the unipolarity and to create a multipolar world system. So, as if now it is clear that there is one side, G7 countries, of course led by US, G7 and NATO, led by US, and on the other side there is Russia, China, Brazil, and India to some extent, and there are other countries which are, and all of them in one way, the countries which are coming together have been victims of the Western dominance, at least since 1990.
Yeah. But this is not something, Abdul, that is limited to those who are not allies of the United States. We've seen, Japan looking at its own energy security issues and therefore looking at Russia as a key partner in that process and therefore refusing to really step in at the same level as some of their Western allies have. And we've talked often before about European hypocrisy, so we leave that out of it for the moment. We were talking yesterday on the show about South Korea and the challenges that friendship or relationship is also facing, particularly in the context of the Ukraine war, the intel leaks that are coming out. Forget about the different sides of the spectrum for now. Even within what the US is trying to put together as its common platform, it doesn't seem as strong as it was a year or more ago.
I don't think so. If you see what Macron did or is saying, at least since his visit to China. As you pointed out about the positions taken by Japan and Korea, South Korea. And there are various other examples. For example, if you see India, traditionally is, at least post 1990, has been very close to what US position had been on the global fora. But in the case of Russia, it has taken a kind of a very quote-unquote balancing position in which it talks about its economic interest and its traditional links with Russia, but on the other side talks about undesirability of war and provocations by NATO and so on and so forth. So, of course, it seems that is what happens when the hegemonic presence of US or any idea breaks. And the initial signs are quite clear that even their traditional allies, considered to be the backbone of their overall project, global project, they are basically slipping away, and they're slipping away primarily because the policies which are attempted to kind of create hegemony serve the interest of a particular section of a particular country. Will lead to the disagreements, and because other countries also have their own interest. They want to serve their own people in whatever way possible, and they don't want to always follow the diktats of a particular country, irrespective of the their own interest.
And in the case of electoral democracies, maintain their positions of power.
Of course, that is one of significant. In some cases, that becomes the most decisive. The primary motive. In India is one example, of course. So, and that basically is creating this particular break within the traditional. So, G7 countries meeting together will talk about continuing with the sanctions, but at the same time, a section of that particular grouping will also try to develop their own relationship with Russia, or at least maintain the existing relationship. If you ask me not to talk about Europe, but if you see that the European countries agreed to follow US diktats as it is, but just to give one example, when it comes to the importing grains from Ukraine, the grain producing countries of Europe found it not it is not in their interest, and now at least 3 countries have come out in open and said they will not follow the European Union's policy. So this basically defines, indicates towards the growing assertion of individual country, and ultimately leading to a much more better world, which is multipolar, multilateral, and based on multilateralism.
All right. Thanks very much, Abdul. We'll leave it there for today. But of course, we will keep this conversation going as the trip develops and other things also come up. We'll move on to our next story now, which is from India, where the Supreme Court, actually a constitutional bench of the Supreme Court, is discussing a matter that is considered by the Chief Justice of India to be of significant importance to the general public. The matter at debate is same-sex marriage, and a group of petitions have actually been put together and are being heard over the course of a few days beginning today. We're using this opportunity as a primer for our international audience to put forth the arguments being made in favor of same-sex marriage and its legalization in India, as well as what various sections of Indian society is saying about why this should happen and this is the correct way forward, and what are the kind of arguments being made. Pragya Singh of NewsClick will be joining us to discuss that. Pragya, good to have you in the Daily Debrief studios as always. This is the same government that very soon after coming into power removed or reversed a colonial era law that essentially criminalized same-sex relationships, Article 377 as it was known, giving hope to the LGBTQ plus community of a more inclusive kind of legal structure and legal guarantees, legal safeties that they would be afforded in terms of being able to express themselves and their sexuality and other aspects of life. And now marriage has come into the fold. Is it being met with the same kind of optimism that was there just before the judgment decriminalizing or removing 377 when that happened?
Well, Siddhant, even when the Section 377, which criminalized same-sex, same-gender sex, the government of the day wasn't exactly in favor. And in fact, they're presenting the same arguments about Indian tradition, Indian culture, what's acceptable and what's not, when it comes to marriage equality as well, which often is known as the same-sex marriage rights. The government did pass a law protecting transgender persons law after the Supreme Court of India said that, well, you can no longer, have this kind of a statute on the books. So what's actually really interesting about this moment in India is that the government continues to oppose it. Several government bodies, national bodies have said that, when it comes to rights that flow from marriage, for example, adoption, that they would not welcome this, going in favor of the petitioners. And there are also, for example, former judges of various courts who have got together and said that, well, don't let this pass. So I would say that it is a moment of hope, but it's also a moment of struggle. And, the other interesting part is that this is a moment of one of those rare moments in India when you talk about marriage, which means you talk about family, which means you talk about it not as a socio-religious institution, but also something which is legal, constitutionally defined, and which therefore is open to be interpreted in ways that society sees fit at a particular time. So there were 9 petitions. They've been moved from the various high courts across the country to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that a constitutional bench, a 5-bench, constitutional bench is going over this matter. They started today. The arguments should end on Thursday. And the government, which is a right-wing Hindu nationalist government, and several other outfits which are loosely or strongly affiliated with it have said that, they do not support same-sex marriage. They do not think of all citizens of India having the same right to get married.
All right, thanks very much, Pragya, for that today. And hopefully, we will be covering this important story in a country that is now, I think, the most populous in the world and therefore
Yes.
impacts a lot of people in detail as proceedings go on in court. And with that, we finally move on to our last bit for today, which is from the United States, where it is now clear that the police officers involved in the killing of Jayland Walker, a 25-year-old man, after what was a routine traffic stop gone wrong. Jalen Walker was shot multiple times, shot and killed. And now police officers in Akron, Ohio will not be charged with any sort of criminal offense in relation to that murder. This is, of course, nothing new in the United States, and we know that there has been a movement on the streets against this kind of systematic or systemic police racism, brutality, and violence that often finds at the victim end someone from a minority community, either the black community or the Hispanic community or a gender or a sexual minority. To talk more on the subject is Anish, who covers the region for People's Dispatch and has been following the details of the case. Anish, not great news coming in from the United States, but also not surprising in a country that seems to be kind of, at least in terms of its leadership, bipartisanly decided on the fact that dealing with all kinds of crime is only sort of from the perspective of increasing funding and militarizing the police and and therefore leaves you no choice but to also then increase the impunity with which these police forces operate when they're going about their day-to-day business. The Jayland Walker case and the grand jury verdict, did it surprise you in any way?
Not necessarily, because, but the thing is that a lot of people are shocked primarily because of the details of the case. We have to remember that as per the Attorney General's statement itself, there were about 94 rounds of shots fired by 8 police officers on one man who was essentially cornered. And of these 94 rounds of firing, about 46 of them actually hit the person, hit Jalen, 5 of which were to the back. So the details show that there is at least, the very least, a case to be made for the charges to be put on trial and for a proper trial to actually happen where evidence can be presented. But the entire decision of the grand jury, for those of our viewers who do not know, a grand jury in the United States essentially decides whether or not somebody goes through trial and whether the indictment actually goes through, any kind of evidence presentation and stuff like that. So essentially, it's a very important part of the court process. And if the grand jury decides that somebody is not set to be on trial, it really, the case doesn't really move forward. So this is a criminal charge that were placed against these 8 officers, 3 of whom actually fired about 18 rounds of shot. And that's just, that's just the basic details of this case. There are other factors that, like the fact that Jalen was unarmed at the time of his shooting, but the entire decision hinged on just this one fact that during the car chase that preceded the shooting, he actually fired 1 shot at the police car or in the direction of the police car. And that is the only thing that they assumed was a good enough reason for the police to go essentially scot-free. And this is pretty much why a big part of the civil society movement in the United States are just shocked, because the bare details show that there was very clear overreaction on the part of the police. There was a very sort of unjustified use of force by the
Massively
police.
disproportionate use of force, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, a very disproportionate use of force. And this, despite that, there is not even a trial that is going to be happening in this case. And this is just, and these details were not something that the prosecution came up with or the family came up with. These details are something that the very police investigated and found themselves. So that shows that in this at a time when calls for police reforms and even police abolition is actually gaining foothold in the United States. The fact that the police, the institutions that support the police, are not in any mood to actually move towards even the reform territory, let alone abolition or other kind of more radical changes. So this is not even about reform. This is basically about bringing into account for a killing and a very gruesome killing where the victim was essentially even handcuffed right after being shot 46 times. And that just clearly shows that this whole case is just just disappointing on multiple levels.
Yeah, absolutely, Anish, and an opportunity for the judicial system, the justice system in the United States to tell its minority communities that we do take these concerns kind of seriously, and at least like you were saying, to the extent of having a trial, having evidence presented, and then letting a jury of the peers of these police officers come to a decision on whether or not they should be held responsible and accountable for their actions. Do you look at it as a missed opportunity, and how is sort of the movement on the ground, Black Lives Matter movement, the wider movement for racial justice, how is it being perceived in those quarters?
Well, in the case of jury, it's always best for any kind of judiciary to not be beholden by public opinion in some way or the other. But in this case, at least the jury, there was clear merit to the case. You can actually have multiple legal luminaries talking about how it could go through a trial, whether or not you agree if the police use force in a justified manner. It should go through. It should have gone through a trial, but it just did not happen. So there is obviously certain issues with how it's not just the jury, because it's also how the entire system perceives the police and their actions in general. There is a very inherent set of bias that kind of kind of uh, advantages any kind of racial profiling in the system, and that just is the case in this matter as well, because you're looking at somebody who was chased with no good reason. First of all, there was no alcohol or drugs in his system, and during the time of the shooting, he was just unarmed. So this was something that could have been apparent to any police officer at the scene, but nevertheless, they took the action to actually just riddle him with bullets to begin with, and that just creates, that just shows that there is a certain level of impunity that is going to go completely unchecked in the present system. We are talking about a system that kills about 1,000 people annually, around 1,000 people annually, and when we look at even the charges filed against police officers, it just numbers in dozens, not even hundreds. And conviction rates are, very, very low, to the point where you can just count on your fingertips at some certain level. And so this is the situation that we're looking at. And something far more radical needs to happen, but obviously the political establishment is never really ready for that. And how the grassroots movement take this forward is going to be, because we are going to obviously look at an intensified level of resistance. That is definitely going to happen. But what will be the outcome of it? Because you're looking at a very compromised system in itself. So if whether or not there is some kind of hope or respite from the present system is something that the grassroots movement need to decide by themselves. And we need to wait and see how that follows through in the coming days.
Right. Thanks very much, Anish. We'll leave it there for today. That's all we have on this episode of the Daily Debrief. From Anish, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch, thank you very much for watching. As always, we encourage you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories and all of the other work we do. Don't also forget to give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.